Right. Okay, we're at 22 seconds. And 12 seconds. This is the part where I start picking people out in the back who are still standing and outing them, and it starts to get really, no, I won't do that. Great, okay. Welcome everyone, good morning. Good morning. Has anyone learned anything new yet? Raise your hand if you learned something new. Okay. I promise you're going to learn something new during this plenary. It's going to be, as with most of the breakouts and plenaries we've had so far, it's going to be full of great information with great presentations. I will point out that a lot of the stuff you're going to hear about, even the extended versions thereof, are at your table. So if you want to, we put a couple copies of everything there for those who want to go deeper. So again, I'm Steve Patrick. Clarity about the name, Steve Patrick. And I'm the executive director of the Aspen Forum for Community Solutions. And we have a really exciting panel for you. So I'll just introduce them very quickly. Tia Martinez is down at this end. I'm just going to come this way. Many of you may know about Tia's 25 years of work in this space in social justice, period. Kind of a legend in many ways for her research and her synthesis and her deep dive work. Look up her legendary research with Michael Wald from back in the day in the Bay Area that was one of the first efforts to disaggregate the opportunity youth population, and really kind of very much the groundwork for a lot of what you all do now, whether you know it or not. Arnold Chandler, how many of you saw Arnold in New Orleans? Yeah, right? So he is back by popular demand. We don't do that very often. And you'll recall it in New Orleans, I introduced him as rock star mad scientist, and afterwards, everyone came up to me and said, that's exactly who Arnold is. So he's back. And now, wow, Dr. Pam Cantor joins us. And I think a lot of you are familiar with her work. A lot of you know about the kind of groundbreaking research she's done to really articulate the challenges that come from trauma and how do we overcome that in terms of education and opportunity for young people. And so we couldn't be more excited to have Dr. Cantor in the mix. And we're not going to waste too much more time with introductions or with me blabbering on as I'm prone to do. And we're going to jump in. And all I'll say is please look at the bios for these guys in your packets, because we want you to know the full robustness of their experience and background. And we're going to start with Arnold. And Arnold, do you want to jump up as I say? Arnold's going to do kind of the abridged version of the Cliff Notes version of the life course framework, if you will, in the context of trauma. So I want to name that's what we're really talking about during this plenary. And then we're talking about how to make change as we learn what we're going to learn today. So Arnold, please, welcome.
Thank you. So I'll probably stay over here, since now that you all are up here, I don't want to walk in front of everybody. I'm prone to walk across the stage when I do this presentation.
Okay.
Good morning, everyone. I'm glad to be back with this crew. We were here in the spring together, and I did a longer version of the presentation I'm going to do now. We had to shorten it, so there's some high points that we had to take out, frankly, because I want to spend this time scaffolding the presentations of my two star colleagues up here who are going to dazzle you with a lot of impressive stuff coming up shortly. And so my task really is to orient you to the presentation I did before and highlight where it's going to intersect with what you're going to see shortly. You guys may not know that me and Tia are Forward Change. And so last time it was just me talking about Forward Change. This is the other illustrious better half of Forward Change. And we, as you can see up there, are a mission-driven consulting firm that seeks to improve life outcomes and opportunities for children and young adults and families living in low-income disadvantaged communities. And we've been doing this work for a while, and we use a lot of research in our work, a lot of strategy, but our objective really is to connect with leadership on the ground to make change.
Arnold, we're going to go watch.
Okay.
We'll be right back. Sorry to interrupt. We can't. Tia's coming? Tia's coming.
All right.
We're going to go to this table.
I'll take it.
You still only have 15 minutes.
Okay, let me hurry it up. So as you saw before, for folks who saw it, I'm sorry for folks who didn't see it before, but what we talked about the last time I was here, and I'm going to quickly go over it and just give you a quick primer and then move on. But we talked about the case, which is basically a 40-year arc of history of research, of data, trend lines, of why there's a need to focus on males of color, on boys and men of color. And I argued that there was a gender-specific cycle of intergenerational disadvantage, which I put together with a series of different slides and data to speak to that. I'm not going to recover that ground. I'm just going to summarize where I left off before. And then we're going to look at the life course framework for improving the lives of disadvantaged populations, where we're going to talk about interrupting the cycle that I talked about in the first half. And I'm going to pretty much go through that again to reorient you to where we were and to set you up for the presentations you're going to see in a moment. So when I talked about why focus on boys and men of color, and let me just, for the sake of covering this important caveat to this presentation that I did before, which is when I talk about males of color, there's some important things you need to note about the implications of that. The first thing is that because there's data that shows that males of color are doing poorly on a number of indicators, does not mean that girls are doing well or young women are doing well. I don't want to leave you with that impression because we make that point. The second thing is that what we've been learning a lot from the research and from the work that's been happening over the past couple years, in fact, and being synthesized over the past couple years, is that disadvantage operates gender specifically. So when we think about the opportunity youth population, we have to account for the fact that what might be driving the outcomes of males versus females is very different. And our response to it oftentimes has to be gender differentiated. Tia told me that when she started this work back in the early 2000s, and they did the study on disconnected youth, and they were identifying that population and trying to tease it out, what was most alarming in terms of the population with respect to disconnected youth at the time was what was happening with black young women. That was actually the driving population that created an urgency around this work. Since that time, and I don't know if you all saw the recent Congressional Research Service study that came out literally 3 weeks ago, that's an update of their prior report from, I believe, the early 2000s, in which they show that that issue has reversed dramatically. Now it is black males, in stark relief from black females who are part of that disconnected population. So we've seen this swing over the course of these decades, and it's very much a gender-specific dynamic driven by some factors which we often point to, being mass incarceration being probably one of the biggest boogeymen in this equation. And the last thing about the gender dynamic is that even though I might analytically separate out what's happening with males, I don't want to leave you with the impression that what's happening to males does not impact what's happening with females. Meaning the lives of boys and girls and mothers and fathers are inextricably intertwined. So what drives mass incarceration affects women overwhelmingly by how it affects the men in their lives. And so even though we might look at this population, we're talking about whole families, we're talking about whole communities in here and how we think about this. So let me move on, because I know I only got 15 minutes and I want to make sure I cover everything. So what I covered last time, we looked at declining employment and earnings over the past 50 years, and we talked about the factors that have driven declining employment and earnings that are well established in the literature. We also talked about the fact that mass incarceration is a new big factor that has been driving declining employment and earnings among low education men, which is a factor we didn't really see driving outcomes before the 1970s. And both of these have had a direct impact on the growth in disadvantaged families that we've seen over the past 40 to 50 years in the case of African Americans, but about the past 35 years in the case of white folks and also Latinos. In terms of growth of disadvantaged families, and I identified disadvantaged families both in terms of single-parent families and low-income families, which have been on the rise, they have gender-specific effects on the educational outcomes for the boys in those families relative to the girls in those families. Boys are disproportionately more negatively impacted when a father is absent or when both parents have low education or both have low income. And as a consequence, you have the makings of an intergenerational cycle, as I described it. Stagnant educational attainment, in turn, raises the likelihood of declining employment and earnings, raises the probability of being incarcerated in one's lifetime, and then in turn starting a family that will eventually dissolve and recreate the cycle. So that's why I left the first part of the discussion. Actually, before I left the first part of the discussion, I talked about the fact that this cycle is concentrated geographically in a way that we haven't really seen before. In the 1970s, we saw the emergence of concentrated poverty, and with it, concentrated disadvantage, in which communities became particularly inhospitable to the development of children. When you concentrate poverty and joblessness, you concentrate everything associated with it, like crime, violence, poor school quality, drugs, disinvestment, et cetera. I also talked about the fact that these neighborhoods are overwhelmingly the supplying neighborhoods for mass incarceration. We send 40% of the prison population is released every year back to their neighborhoods. We have about 5 to 10 ex-felons, people with felony records, out there in returning to these neighborhoods. And overwhelmingly, that 40% that's released from prison returns to the poorest, most vulnerable neighborhoods in our society and are replaced from those neighborhoods overwhelmingly to the prison population. So we have this massive churn that's happening as a result of our prison policies, which were overwhelmingly what caused the prison boom. It was policy decisions. I don't want to go back and recapitulate that, but I just want to emphasize that point, and it's included in your slide deck if you want to take a look at it, some of the evidence that speaks to that. So then we got to the life course framework for improving the lives of disadvantaged populations, and this is where we tried to wrangle some of that complexity, and this is going to set up some of what my colleagues are going to present in a moment. We talked about the 3 big building blocks of the framework. Dimensions of human development, what we start with in life, our genetics, and what develops over people's lives. Examples are physical health, cognitive development, mental health, socio-emotional skills, et cetera. Life course outcomes are the things that I call above the hood. These are the things that we track, that we actually, researchers study, that elected officials run for office on, improving high school graduation rates, improving school readiness. These dimensions of human development, however, what I call under the hood. We don't actually track these very well. We don't see these. We don't see kids who walk around with the outward manifestations of trauma that they've experienced early in life. We don't know that's what's going on. We see bad behavior and we respond with behavioral responses like discipline and kicking them out of school. And so life course outcomes on the right side are the things that, get the most of our attention, that we track with data systems, but we don't often respond as effectively to the underlying things that actually drive those outcomes. And then what drives both of those and shapes both of those are ecological and contextual factors. The environmental and experiential factors that shape our human development and our life course outcomes, including our families, neighborhoods, schools, and public systems. So looking quickly at dimensions of human development, this is a place where I want to set up Dr. Cantor's presentation a bit, just to provide some pointers of how this connects with what she's going to discuss. Before we talked about dimensions of human development, we talked about physical health, cognitive development, mental health and sense of well-being, socio-emotional development, more identity development, what I call store of content and cultural knowledge, moral development, and personality. Now, what I want to highlight for you are physical health, cognitive development, and socio-emotional development that Dr. Cantor is going to cover. And what's important here is the burgeoning research that shows how disadvantage and adversity becomes biologically embedded in our bodies. When we experience chronic stress and trauma earlier in life, it has enduring effects on a whole array of biological systems, and it shows up in all kinds of ways later in life. Some of the most important factors that drive this are stress. Stress is the critical linchpin that drives this. It leads to things like HPA axis dysregulation. I'm going to mention these. I'm not going to try and connect all the dots here, but I want to give you some of the terms of art that organize this literature and how we talk about this. Allostatic load, which we know from HPA axis dysregulation, allostatic load lead to the impairment of working memory, which is an essential ingredient to reasoning and learning. And so these early embedding of disadvantage undermines the later contributors to the life course outcomes that we pay attention to. Whether we graduate from high school, whether we have good test scores in the 4th grade, these early embedded disadvantages are underlying drivers of those outcomes. And then lastly, it hijacks our stress response and contributes to things like socio-emotional challenges that emerge in all kinds of social contexts, particularly later in the workplace, where we know socio-emotional skills are now rivaling cognitive skills in our ability to thrive and succeed in life. I talked about that you can array these on an equalizer diagram like this and put it on a life course. Now I'm gonna skip that because I only got 2 minutes left. And so I want to put all the outcomes up here and just give you a lead into what Tia is going to present.
By the way, there are a lot of words in there that none of us knew what they meant. And so we're gonna learn about those.
Absolutely, and
right?
Dr. Cantor is going to probably cover all that territory.
Teaser.
And she'll make it more digestible than me just throwing these words at you. Life course outcomes. Last time we talked about critical life course outcomes that are on track or off track to some critical milestone that we identify later in life that we want kids to achieve. It could be middle-class wage by the time they're 30, graduating from college, completing college, whatever your long-term outcome is, we try to identify from the literature what seem to be the strongest and most predictive milestones across that course. preterm birth and low birth weight, secure attachment, school readiness in terms of both cognitive and social emotional skills measured in kindergarten, proficient in 4th grade math and reading and socio-emotional skills, not proficient as the off track, proficient in good grades, not proficient, fails math or English, behavior problems and discipline, juvenile delinquency, especially violent arrest, detention, criminal offending, especially violent arrest, felony conviction, incarceration, and recidivism, high school graduation, dropout, college enrollment, college completion, college dropout, post-secondary credential, disconnected from school and work, untreated substance abuse or behavioral health problem, stable housing, housing to instability or homelessness, stable full-time employment, long-term unemployment or underemployment greater than 6 months, stable full-time employment at 3% federal poverty level, earning below 300% poverty level, or in particular earning below the federal poverty level, as 2 important indicators of increasing depth in that outcome. I'm going to skip the last 2 for the sake of time. These are other ones that we identified that are implicated, and the ones you just saw that are now in blue: chronic absence, teenage fatherhood, and child support in arrears. Now I'm going to skip the intergenerational piece, just because I'm out of time, because I want to make sure to set up where Tia's going to go in just a second. Okay, thanks. So where Tia's going to go is to take some of these outcomes that we just looked at and identify what the school-to-prison pipeline means as an actual trajectory of outcomes and how they relate to each other. She's going to relate things like place and schools and public systems as some of the ecological factors that we didn't have time to look at, but they're listed in your packets. And she's going to show how, when we put it in the context of our historical change, when I talk about mass incarceration, I've also kind of umbrellaed that in this notion of the punishment era that we've entered into over the last 4 decades. Because we've also changed how we respond to kids in schools dramatically with a variety of zero tolerance approaches that have just metastasized from our criminal justice system. And those responses have triggered this school-to-prison pipeline. The metaphor is derived fundamentally from how we treat kids in school and push them out or push them on a pathway where they're likely to end up incarcerated and see the proceeds of that in their later life outcomes. School discipline, behavioral problems, driven by other things, but primarily talked about in terms of the institutional response, leads to an increased likelihood of juvenile delinquency, high school dropout, which in turn both raise the probability of mass incarceration, of going to prison by the time that person is in their teens and early 20s, and then leads to this whole cascade of negative outcomes across the life course, which severely reduces the probability that they ever get back on track later in life and get to some critical on-track outcome. So some of the takeaways that are going to be informed by this, both this presentation and these presentations, is that we have to think about this from a life course standpoint. Think about how what happens earlier gets implicated in what happens later. So whenever we're encountering a person of disadvantage or a person whose lives we're trying to turn around, recognize that there's a deep life history that's implied in the outcomes that we're trying to change. We have to focus on 2 generations, recognizing that what's happening with parents is driving what's happening with their children, and focusing on one to the neglect of others, often swimming against the stream. We need to be gender-specific in our analysis of causes, correlates, and solutions, and recognize what drives the outcomes of boys and girls are different, and how we respond has to be modified with that knowledge. We need to change conditions through policy and systems change. Programs are necessary but not sufficient in terms of how we turn around some of these outcomes. We have to change policy. We have to change mass incarceration. And many of you are dealing with policy and have been in this work, and you recognize the need to do that. But policy's hard to change. Mass incarceration could take a long time. It could take a generation to tear it down the same way it took a generation to build it up. So we need to build the resiliency of young people to conditions that are terrible right now. We need programs, services, and practices, in particular, that work for kids based upon their gender. And then lastly, we need multi-issue collaboratives like all of you in all of your communities that are pulling together across a variety of streams of work, a variety of ways of viewing the world and trying to change outcomes. And that's my piece.
Okay, so now we're just going to jump right into Tia. And as a segue on the life course framework, it's important to note that national organizations, coalitions are coalescing around this framework, which I'm very excited about. So whether it's 50 funders called the Executive Alliance for Boys and Men of Color adopting this as a framework, or Cities United, 60+ cities that are coalescing around ending violence in America's cities, they're all looking at this and adopting it. And even My Brother's Keeper Alliance, the new organization, has seen this. I know that because Alan Ludgate's in the audience and he's leading much of that work. Where are you, Alan? So My Brother's Keeper folks are paying attention to this, so it's a great framework for getting to action. Tia, how are we going to get to action?
Sure. So I'm gonna. Am I on? Yes. Can folks hear me? Okay, great. So what I'm going to do is take we spend a lot of time in the research literature, which breaks things down into little tiny pieces. How we understand things and how we learn is through stories. So I'm going to tell a story. Take all that research, I'm going to put it back into a story, okay? And this is the story of a young person, and this is going to be looking at that life course, because everyone has that life course. That life course isn't specific to a certain demographic group, but I'm going to talk about in this the experience of young people of color, in particular young boys and men, okay? A review of our argument in short. Really quick on this, remember that in the last 40 years, we've seen massive changes, the structural shifts in the economy. With the structural shifts in the economy, in 1970, who was the largest employer in the United States? Can people guess? General Motors, and today, who is the largest employer? Walmart. General Motors, Walmart, that's all we need to say. We talked about how that interacted with mass incarceration and the war on drugs, the growth of disadvantaged families, and this rise then of places of concentrated disadvantage, right? I'm going to talk a little bit about how all of this then combined with this rise of what we're calling exclusionary discipline. And what we mean by that is discipline that pushes kids out of the school, okay, right? It's green like the mass incarceration one. We're going to talk a lot about how it's an echo of. So you're going to see school policy and school numbers echoing what was happening in the criminal justice field. But while it was echoing that, it was also interacting with some unintended consequences of standards-based accountability. In particular, as most of you folks here know, NCLB didn't have strong guidance or requirements for high schools and for high school graduation as an important accountability indicator. What that meant is that until 2008, when Spelling rewrote those regs, and they actually didn't go into practice until 2012, there was basically an incentive to get rid of your lowest performing students, right? Which further incentivized push out, and we ended up with this situation where you have systematically pushing young people from the most disadvantaged neighborhoods and families out of the school system and into the criminal justice system. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take that and talk about how when we did that, what we did is hasten and reinforce this intergenerational transmission of disadvantage. So across from parents to children. So rising rates of suspension. Remember I said, we haven't always suspended lots of kids out of school. In fact, in the 70s, we didn't do it that much, okay? This is the national rate of out-of-school suspension. What this number is the percent of students who've ever been suspended out of school in a school year, okay? So some of them were suspended 10 times, some one. This right here is whites, right? It almost doubles. It was 3%, 3 out of 100 kids were suspended one or more times. And by 2011-12, it's 5%. This is Latinos. Look at Latinos was equal to whites in 72, 73. It more than doubles, right? And we get to 7%, and that little space, the space in between the blue and yellow, that's that emergence of the school discipline gap. This is African Americans, okay? Went from 6%, 6 out of 100, to fully 16%. Remember, these rates are K-12, y'all. These include babies. These include little kids. The rates at the secondary level are much higher, all right? So we have this tripling, right, for African American rates. And a number of things are happening. The emergence of zero tolerance, the introduction of school police and school resource officers, practices including referrals to police directly from the school, referral to juvenile court directly from school. So things that were formerly dealt with in school as discipline issues became criminal justice issues, right? So I want to show you, though, what happened before that. This is the same exact period. This is national incarceration rates, state and federal, 72 to 2012, okay? That's the rate of incarceration per 100,000. It actually, the increase is closer to 5 times. I have 4 times there, but it's closer to 5 times. Look at the green lines. They're echoing each other, and literally the policy, oops, how do I go backwards? There we go. if you think about the policy innovations, where does zero tolerance come from, the term? It comes from the war on drugs, right? That's what it came from, right? The war on drugs, when we talk about the upping of penalties, right? Sentencing reform, mandatory minimums. Think about in the school context, what that meant is suddenly being defiant meant you were suspended out of school, where before it meant maybe you had an in-school suspension, or maybe you had to go to detention afterwards. But this inflating of the consequences for more minor, non-violent behaviors. I'm going to set a baseline for us. This is 11-12. It's the most recent federal data. What do suspensions look like? A key piece of this story is about race and disability, okay? So we need to go face that front on. These are the rates of suspension for elementary students. These are K-5 students, guys. Note, 8% of African American, K through 5, okay, that's 5 to 11-year-olds, are suspended out of school at least once. 2% Latino, 2% white. Now, these are the high school rates. Look at that. First of all, note a gap between Latino and white emerges. So 7% of white kids are suspended, 11% of Latino, and almost 1 in 4 black students, okay? Now I'm gonna add in, what do I add in now? Disability. I'm gonna add in disabilities. This is special education, okay? That's how it's defined here, right? Notice you got 9% white, 14% Latino, and 30% African American. And finally, this is high school and middle school male African Americans with disabilities at a rate of 34%, 1 in 3. Now remember, kids with disabilities and IEPs have special protections. This is actually surprising. They actually are not allowed to be suspended for 10 or more days over the school year for behavior that is a manifestation of that disability. This is mind-blowing, okay? 34, 23, 16%. One thing I want to point out before I go, we talk about how race and gender play. We always have to be going back to the data and thinking about some of the ways it's manifesting. What I just put up there right now, that 23%, that's female African American middle or high school students with disabilities. So 23, this is for black girls with disabilities in middle and high school. Notice something. It's equal to or higher than the men, Latino men or white men, right? So this issue has a huge impact on black girls too. That's how that's playing out. So now I'm going to begin to take you through what life course looks like in a Prezi that everyone will get a connection to so that you can take a look at it. And I'm just waiting for it to come up. Here we go. Okay, thank you, perfect. Okay, so school to prison, this is the school to prison pipeline, okay? So first, these are the age, 5 to 11, 12 to 17, 18 to 24, and 25 and up, right? This is what Arnold laid out, right? We're gonna talk about a pipeline that's essentially an institutional handoff, right? The kids go through. From elementary school, secondary school, to the police, to juvenile justice, to jail, to prison, to the experience of having a felony record, to intergenerational transmission of disadvantage. Let's begin at the beginning. We begin with a conflict, at least the teacher perceives a conflict with the student, okay? What does that teacher do? She makes an office referral, okay? And what does she get when she makes that office referral? What happens immediately? The kid leaves, the kid's gone. The kid's out of the classroom, right? You know, so remember the context. You have all of these kids coming in from neighborhoods and families which have been structurally set up to be just little stress pots, right? With all of this intense stuff happening, and then the 5-year-old walks in and has behavior that's saying, this is me coping, this is my body doing its best that it can, right? And what does the teacher do? We got to get this kid out because we have other kids who want to learn, right? And mind you, race plays a huge role in this. Studies have shown that basically when you give teachers 2 scenarios, one, a very minor misbehavior, right? Walking around during class, talking during class. And they basically gave, some of the stories had sort of stereotypically black names, some stereotypically white names. They randomized them, right? And then they wanted to see what the teachers would say of how disruptive this is and what kind of punishment. So on the whole thing about this is this kid does it twice. So you got the kid, they do it once, and then a couple days later they do it again, right? So what they found is on the first one, there was no difference between black and white. Teachers found it was the same amount of irritation, the same amount of school discipline, but on the second, the African-American numbers shoot up. Now African-American kids, remember the only difference is that name has been changed, are seen as more disruptive of teaching. They're seen as hindering other kids' learning. They are referred to harsher discipline, and they're more likely to be labeled troublemakers and for the teachers to see this as part of a pattern. So race plays in all of this. And then we get to out-of-school suspension, right? And we talked about how this has just blown up. What happens when you're suspended out of school? This is just kind of common sense. The first thing that happens, just like the teacher doesn't have to deal with the kid in the office referral, right, is that you have a decrease in supervised learning time, right? You're not around grown-ups, you're not learning, okay, right? Now, unsurprisingly, right, this means you fall behind, right? And we know from an amazing study out of Texas, looked at like 1 million sixth graders and followed them for like 8 years. But they were able to really carve out the independent effect of being suspended out of school. So if someone tells you, well, kids who are suspended are more likely to drop out, if they're not controlling for all the other things that are going on, right, maybe the kid is suspended because they're behind, and that was why they were fooling around. Well, maybe because they're academically behind is why they dropped out. What this study was able to do is basically take a kid who gets suspended and compare it to a kid exactly like that kid. So they're the same, their test scores, their grades, their past behavioral history, the type of school, their family, and then figure out what was the difference. And this was the difference. The kid who got suspended was 2 times as likely to have to repeat a grade, okay? And 2 times as likely to drop out. Same time that you get a decrease in supervised learning around supervised learning time, you get an increase in unsupervised time in poor racially segregated neighborhoods. These are the neighborhoods Arnold was talking about, right? These are neighborhoods that are over-policed and underprotected. This means then the young person isn't in school, they're on the streets, increased exposure to order maintenance policing, stop and frisk, broken windows, and community violence. So that's what kids are being put out into, okay? It makes it very likely then that they have an interaction with the police that leads to an arrest. And when you get arrested, this increases the likelihood that you will have contact with the juvenile justice system. And if you have contact with the juvenile justice system and you end up in detention, incarceration, this has an independent effect. Again, this is a very cool study that I'm not going to give you a million details on, but independent effect, this takes out all the other stuff about the kind of kids who would go and get incarcerated, right? But it basically, it increases the probability of dropping out by 13 percentage points, which is huge. That's an enormous impact. And the impact is the greatest on what they talk about, the marginal kid. So the kid whose the offense was nonviolent, right? And they end up being in detention for 2 weeks. They come back. Many times they can't even re-enroll in school. LA will bounce kids around for sometimes 6 months so that they can't get back in school. So by this time, how are you feeling by the time you get back in the classroom? Are you engaged? You feel like you belong? You excited, right? Or do you feel like something's stacked against you? We get this, the first of these self-reinforcing loops. This goes round and round. And what it does is it makes it really likely by the time you're 18 that 2 things have happened in your life, okay? The first thing is you dropped out of high school, okay? And we know that that doubles to quadruples the probability of going to prison. I like to talk a little bit about what life was like in the 70s, what life is like now. Because remember, most of the people making policy in this country, they're thinking about the 70s and 80s when they were in their 20s, right? So in the 70s, a black male dropout faced a 15% chance of going to prison over their lifetime. What do you think it is today? So that would be like a black man drops out of high school, born in the 50s, right? Now let's say you were born in like the late 70s or 80s. What's your probability of lifetime probability of prison? And you drop out of high school. Same demographics. Nearly 70%. Okay, in California, where I come from, it's 90%. It's 90%. 90% of black male high school dropouts are in prison. Now, that doesn't count jail. This is just state and federal prison. Okay. The other thing that it makes it increasingly likely that you hit 18 having been in juvenile incarceration, having been detained. And when you've been in detention, when you've been incarcerated as a juvenile, this has an enormous independent impact on the probability that you end up in prison, adult incarceration. And this specifically was looking at prison. It increases it by 22 percentage points. This is what it did. 1 in 15 of the kids in the study went to prison, okay? Now, the independent impact, right, of being detained brought that up to 1 in 3. So this means you end up here, felony conviction, right, incarcerated. We know these rates have skyrocketed. Now, not everybody stays, right? Not everybody stays in this country. What if you don't have papers? What happens? And you're arrested and you end up with a felony charge and you're convicted. Where do you go? You go to immigrant detention and you get deported. Okay? Right? You disappear completely from your family's life. You could be held indefinitely. Remember, the same companies that are running the private prisons run the detention centers, okay? And since 1996, immigrant detention has increased by 500%. Now, if you stay in here and you do your time, by this time, in this chain, right, how many times have you said, I need some help? How many times have then been like, this is difficult, could you help me? And at every single point, you've been punished and pushed out, right? So by this time, this is what's happened. You get over half of people in prison with a substance abuse issue, over half with a mental health problem. Combined, it's around 70%. People are suffering and they're sick at this point, right? Missed your chance for prevention, this is where you end up. And each additional year in prison takes 2 years off your lifespan. Okay, it's a dose effect. And that's not because prison conditions are horrible and medical stuff there's horrible, which it is, right? Do you know what it is? It's about what happens when you get released. When you get released, you are a felon. And with that label, all of the outlawed old forms of discrimination that our ancestors died for are legal now. You can be discriminated in housing, student loans, education. Everything that people put their life on is now completely legal. Okay? And what does that mean? If there's legal discrimination in everything, is it surprising that research shows over and over again that people with felony records have an increased probability of low earnings, housing instability, and untreated health problems, right? And what happens when you are homeless and you're sick and you don't have money or a job? What are you more likely to do? Recidivate. And if you recidivate, what does that do? You go back to prison and you get the second negative feedback loop. That keeps running until, in a very important way, it gets to your children, okay? This is a study looking at high school dropouts 2 decades after release from prison. 20 years, okay? 75% remained in the bottom 20% of the income distribution. Those folks who didn't go to prison, about 30%. What it does is it makes the bottom of the income distribution incredibly sticky, incredibly hard to get out of, almost a certainty that you stay there. And if you stay there, who else stays there? Your children. Your own stalled social mobility then is passed to your children. And what do we know about the children of incarcerated parents? We know that they struggle a lot. We know actually that the impact of having your father incarcerated on infant mortality is the same as your mom smoking. So from before you were born, this stuff is impacting you. But we know the children of incarcerated parents, especially boys, are more likely to display externalizing behavior. And what's externalizing behavior? Acting out, aggressive behavior, all those kind of things that then make it so much more likely that you get suspended from school. And that's the final loop. So we're going to talk about in the breakout sessions that I'm doing. This can be daunting, but I'm going to show you how at every single point policy decisions were made that we can make differently, okay? And we can go through every one of these boxes and talk about what needs to be done to break this cycle, okay? With that, I'm going to hand it over.
Name 2 things right now to you that's happening to end the school-to-prison pipeline. Just like
Sure.
2 one-sentence bullets.
Okay, 2 things to, okay. Well, first of all, getting rid of really broad areas. So we know that about half the kids 4 or 5 years ago in California who were suspended for something called willful defiance. It's this broad category, which means you looked at me wrong. It could mean a lot of things, right? You know, but it's not like chewing tobacco, because that's a different offense, right? But it's really broad, and it's where a lot of implicit bias goes in. So there have been attempts at local levels, at school levels, at district levels, and at the state level to limit the use of that. We're able to limit that use for K to 3rd graders. We're pushing this year to limit it, to get it off the books for K to 12. And we've seen amazing, and in my breakout session, we'll talk about this, school level turnarounds where you have suspensions almost being extinguished and test scores going up consistently, and going up the most for the most disadvantaged groups. And the other piece, just further down here, Prop 47, I mentioned, in California, basically took a bunch of nonviolent felonies and recategorized them as misdemeanors. What does that do? It's retroactive. It means a ton of people who have drug felonies on their records get the felony removed. And so we've removed that marker, as long as they have no other violent felonies. So those are 2 examples.
Thank you. Let's segue to Dr. Cantor. We kind of, what did you describe the houses, the home life? They were in a something of stress, a what?
Pots.
Stress pot. So we're going to hear about how schools, teachers, all of us can address the issue, the underlying issues around what it means to be in these stressful spaces with children. I'll just, as we segue to Dr. Cantor, you know, there is movement on ending the school-to-prison pipeline. Tia just named a couple of things. I hope some of you will go to her breakout. I think, you know, there is this unbelievable alliance. Doug Wood from the Ford Foundation's here, between the Ford Foundation and the ACLU and the Koch brothers, and a whole lot of unusual suspects in the spirit of Manuel Pastor's opening plenary. And so I think we're seeing movement. We see it in the administration right now, with the administration being very proactive in this space. So that was depressing, Tia, in a really important way. But I also think we have to see the glasses half full around change around this pipeline. Part of the change comes from how young people overcome trauma, and we're privileged to have the expert in our country on that, and we're going to turn it over to Dr. Cantor. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Steve. I want to tell you who I represent in speaking to you today. My own history is someone who has worked for 20 years with children who have known unspeakable kinds of trauma. And in that history of working with children one-to-one, there really is nothing that can shake my belief about what's possible for children, and the healing that's possible, and the growth that's possible. It's not possible to shake that. The thing that means is that the settings in which our children are being raised literally need to become healing environments. And the reason that I went from practice with individual children to working with schools is for schools to become truly places of healing at the neurobiological level. that is one place that could interrupt the cycle that you just heard about, which is really the story of how the social embedding of adversity happens. Arnold and Tia's presentation is a presentation about compound risk. It's about the risks of birth. It's the compounding of that risk because of the rules and the policies that you've heard about. There's one other issue, which is the issue of academia. I was in med school in the 80s, and everything I'm going to be talking to you about today, about the biochemistry of adversity and stress, was known then. So there is a disconnect to how you could have this knowledge locked up in academia and not applied in the settings that need it the most. And that is still true today. Recently, we were at the Ford Foundation, and we were with Sanjeev Rao. And one of the stories that he said was that imagine two kids that are training for a race, doing everything that they need to do with their brains and bodies. But one child is asked to train on a paved, smooth track, and another child is training on a track that's full of bumps, full of rocks. What's going on with our kids? I'm going to make the most powerful case imaginable for what is possible for the brains and bodies of kids. But the story in Tia and Arnold's presentation is that we have to change the ecosystem around kids. We can't expect them to do this on their own. One of the things that I wanted to remind us of is of the children themselves. And I don't know how many of you read or were exposed to Ta-Nehisi Coates' book. Have any of you read that this year? Okay. So I suspect that you paused when you got to this particular paragraph. When I was about your age, each day, fully 1/3 of my brain was concerned with who I was walking to school with, our precise number, the manner of our walk, the number of times I smiled, with who or what I smiled at, who offered a pound and who did not, all of which is to say that I practiced the culture of the streets, a culture concerned chiefly with securing the body. I do not long for those days. I have no desire to make you tough or street, perhaps because any toughness I garnered came reluctantly. I think I was always somehow aware of the price. I think I somehow knew that 1/3 of my brain should have been more concerned with beautiful things. The streets were not my only problem. If the streets shackled my right leg, the schools shackled my left. Fail to comprehend the streets and you give up your body now, but fail to comprehend the schools and you gave up your body later. I suffered at the hands of both, but I resent the schools more. I was a curious boy, but the schools were not concerned with curiosity. They were concerned with compliance. So one of the sentences that came out loudly and clearly in this, fully 1/3 of my brain. What he's talking about is that adversity doesn't just happen to children, it happens inside their brains and bodies through the biologic mechanism of stress. So to illustrate this point, and this might be surprising, I want to talk to you about zebras. I don't know whether you have encountered the book, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, but that book is the story about the fact that our mammalian cousin, the zebra, has the same HPA stress response that we do. And approaching lion, HPA system fires, cortisol goes off, and then when the threat is removed, the body resets and the zebra goes back to munching grass. But the difference between the zebra and us is that for us, stress is remembered. And that has huge, huge implications. So there are really three kinds of stress. Acute stress, somewhat analogous to the zebra, is you experience this extreme stress, the HPA system fires, and then when it's over, the body resets and comes back to normal. But for us, there is also the category of tolerable stress. This is the stress that was so much a part of Arnold's presentation, where there is unrelenting stress. But for many kids, if there is an adult to buffer that stress, the negative impact of that stress is significantly reduced. And then we have toxic stress, which I know lots of you have heard about, which is unrelenting and unbuffered stress. So here's the opportunity we have. If you think about the number of kids you know that you are exposed to whose lives are affected by tolerable stress and toxic stress, it is a huge number. So if we use the science that we're going to talk about today to prevent the effects of tolerable stress and treat the effects of toxic stress, we're talking about millions and millions of kids whose life trajectories will be altered by using this science in our work. But let's go to the science to understand what's actually happening in the brain and the body. So cortisol is the bad actor here that is released. And it has two particular target areas. One is the limbic system, which is the system in our brains that is involved in all meaningful learning. And the limbic system consists of three structures. Arnold spoke about them. The prefrontal cortex, which is involved in attention and memory and self-regulation. The hippocampus has many, many learning functions in the brain, including working memory. But the key structure that differentiates us from our zebra cousin is the amygdala. This is the brain's emotional smoke detector. It remembers the stressful events in our life. And if stress is unremitting, literally the size of that structure grows. And other structures in this brain architecture don't grow as well because these three structures are cross-wired and they speak to each other. The buildup of cortisol can literally change the architecture of the brain. Not forever, okay? That's the main point here, not forever. But this is what can happen if stress is unrelenting and unbuffered. I know that a lot of hands are going to go up here, but how many of you know what an adverse childhood experience is? You've been exposed to this. Okay, so this is a traumatic event that occurs in a child's life before the age of 18. For something to be an ACE, it's things like the experience of abuse, the witnessing of the violent loss of a loved one. That's what we mean when we're talking about ACEs. And there's a colleague and a friend, Nadine Burke-Harris, who's done some of the best work on the health consequences of ACEs. And what she talks about in her clinic are kids that she refers to as my little old people, 10-year-olds with cardiac disease, pulmonary disease, lots and lots of risks around infection. But here is the real cost of ACEs. When kids have greater than 3 or 4 ACEs, and on average, all the kids in the schools where my organization works have greater than 3 or 4 ACEs. We're not talking about 10% of the population. 32 times the risk of learning and behavioral issues. When Tia spoke about that kindergartner who comes in that can't regulate their behavior, this is what we're talking about. 2 to 3 times the risk of heart and lung disease. 10 to 12 times the risk of intravenous drug use. The meaning of this, as is that 8 out of 10 causes of death in this country are associated with children who have greater than 3 to 4 ACEs. One more structure that I want to talk to you about is the nucleus accumbens. This one doesn't make the news as much, but this is a very important brain structure because it's involved in motivation, reward, and it is central to the risk of drug addiction. What happens here is that if children are exposed to toxic stress or unrelenting, unbuffered stress, this structure is affected and the response is dulled. And it means that children will need to do riskier things to get the dopamine boost. So very often that higher risk of risky behavior that Arnold spoke about in the life course framework, the reason that we are seeing that has to do with impact on limbic system, impact on nucleus accumbens. Let's talk about what happens now when children, the children that Tia described, enter school. They come into school from the environments, the environments of concentrated adversity that you were hearing about. How many of you have had that feeling preparing for a test or recital, that feeling of fight or flight? I'm having a little of it sort of right now in my hands, okay? But how many of you have had it, right? Because this is normal. It is totally normal. But kids walking into school are coming in with that feeling and they can't reset. Now imagine they come into a building that's scary. Okay, the first school I ever worked in, PS 132 in Washington Heights, I saw a mom holding the hand of a 5-year-old going into this dark, forbidding building that was in chaos. I thought to myself, how can you leave a child in an environment like this? But the problem is children who are under stress in the ways that we're talking about will be re-triggered walking in the door, and they will shut down. They will not be children with brains available and ready for learning. Imagine one child in a classroom like this, or two, is enough to derail the teaching and learning environment for a teacher, especially an inexperienced one. If you have 30, 40, 50 kids under stress, they can be like a chain reaction playing off each other until you really have and understand the negative culture that happens in these schools. And the adults in these schools, when it gets to that, really don't understand what they can do to reset the environment. I want to give you a vivid picture of what this looks like in a school. I'm sure many of you remember this from The Wire.
Today being the first day, let's have some fun. I'm gonna throw you a little math puzzle, see if I can get you thinking on your feet. Andre is leaving Baltimore.
Mr. Presbo, I need to change my seat because this boy smells like a garbage can.
All right, you need to work a little on your compassion skills.
Yeah, he needs to work a little on his soap and water skills.
All right, like I was saying, my friend Andre is leaving Baltimore. He's going 60 miles an hour.
Hey, what side of Baltimore? East or west?
Right. It doesn't make any difference.
That's what you think.
Okay, east. West. Okay? Okay. And he's going to Philadelphia.
Man, Philly's ass.
So you think Allen Iverson is ass?
Okay, stop.
Yo, he only played for them. He ain't from there. Hey, I never played for the Sixers no matter how much they pay me.
Nigga, they pay your ass to go away.
Enough. Okay, Andre's leaving Baltimore, West Baltimore, traveling 60 miles per hour. He's going to Philadelphia, which is 80 miles away.
Kinda cuff.
Hey, he driving on I-95. You need to watch out for the state police. They be profiling niggas.
He ain't say Andre was black, yeah?
Come on, Randy. Andre from the west side?
Hey, he
Yo,
ain't
you
say
know
he
he
black.
black. You know he black.
You say he traveling in the car? Is he driving?
You know he
Mr. Presbo, you say he traveling in the car? Is he driving? Or is he like in the back seat?
All right. You know what? Fun is fun.
Everything okay in here?
So, to understand and put into context what Tia was talking about, you could look at this and you can say, oh, but this was an inexperienced teacher, or this is a white teacher. What are they doing in a classroom like this? But the fact is, in our high poverty, underperforming schools, inexperienced teachers and teachers without the tools to manage classrooms, to make them into places that are healing, and to be able to overcome what children bring into the classroom are not the tools the teachers have. To understand what my organization does, but I want you to also think of this as you think about work environments and out-of-school environments. Think about environments where primary issue, trust, trustful connections between adults and peers, intentional building of skills in the adults as well as the kids, creating physically and emotionally safe environments, and providing support to the kids who need it the most. When you think about that combination, think about any setting in which children are growing, who are coming into school with these kinds of stressful backgrounds. I know that I'm low on time, but I'm still going to tell you a couple of more stories. Okay? The one thing that you can look at this, you can look at that scene from The Wire, you can look at the presentations of Arnold and Tia, and it can be heartbreaking and it can be discouraging. But here is the thing. Our children's brains are malleable into adulthood. Okay, when I went to med school, it was 0 to 5. That is not true. Okay, so the opportunity, the real opportunity in this group is to take advantage of that knowledge that the brain is malleable and we can build environments intentionally that support the development of the brain straight through into the late 20s. I mean, that's what the literature today supports, and this is a burgeoning field. One of the things that I want to focus on in terms of the fuel for the brain is the issue of trust. How many of you know about the marshmallow study? Okay, marshmallow study, if a child could delay gratification for 15 minutes, it was correlated with everything, including getting into college, high SAT scores, and the like. A very interesting researcher repeated the study because she was working in a homeless shelter, and what she understood was that in her shelter, no child was going to wait for the second marshmallow because they would assume that it would be eaten. The thing that determined whether that child could delay in the homeless shelter was whether you trusted the person giving you the marshmallow. So what I want you to understand is that trust is a neurobiological thing. It is not just a nice to have. What's going on when children feel the trust and the connection to an adult is chemicals fire, serotonin and dopamine. And what that causes is a different hormonal cascade, the oxytocin cascade. And that cascade, oxytocin is called the love hormone. But let's not minimize what that means. In the brain, there are balances of hormonal cascades. And the balance of the cortisol cascade is the oxytocin cascade. So you put children in environments where trust and connection are deep and profound and continuing, and what you have is literally a neurobiological effect of healing. So I want to take this back and say, how do we put all the things that I've been talking to you about together and intentionally use them. I want to talk to you about something that went on at my organization because we asked ourselves a question. We said, okay, context of adversity, how do children acquire the skills and beliefs for learning? How does it start? Is there a progression? Are certain traits foundational for the building of other traits? Because if we got an answer to this question, and we knew we could intentionally build them, this could focus us on a set of skills that would enable children to surmount these kinds of environments that are highly stressful and have the skills to be able to succeed in learning, in work, and in life. So what you see, and you have copies of this on your table, is the building blocks framework. If something is a building block, it's highly correlated with achievement and other kinds of work and learning success. But if you focus on the bottom rows, what you're looking at are the functions of a healthy developing limbic system. So if children between the ages of 0 to 5 develop normally, they develop these skills and they come into kindergarten ready to learn. But the context of adversity changes that. The impact of cortisol and stress causes an uneven, bumpy development of these skills. So kids come into kindergarten, we don't know that they're unready, but we now understand that these skills don't develop evenly for children who have been exposed to adversity. Second thing is that as a result of that, and there are some very, very interesting correlations, that if, everybody is very excited about grit, tenacity is our word for grit, and resilience, because we're talking about how children can become resilient in their ability to cope with adverse backgrounds. Well, there are very strong correlations between foundational skills in self-regulation and executive function and resilience, and same for tenacity. So not only is it important for children to have these skills to be ready for learning and ready for growth, there are strong correlations to the higher order skills that we want kids to have. So we don't really know, Arnold spoke about this, because we don't measure these things. We actually don't know if a child is ready for school, and we don't know if they're ready for work. We just assume it. And very often what goes on in these environments then sets them further and further behind, because complex academic content, when you don't have these skills, means that you fall further and further behind. And that is truly the source of the achievement gap. So the story is uneven beginnings and going into environments that don't intentionally support the development of these skills. But that creates the opportunity that we have. Because if we did have environments, whether they are K-12, whether they are out of school, whether they are for kids coming out of the juvenile justice system, it's not enough to give them a job. It's not enough to give them an opportunity without giving them the opportunity to have genuine skills to succeed. So I'm going to close by telling you my dream. My dream is that we intentionally develop these skills in early childhood, but we don't stop there. That we embed the development of these skills in K-12 so that more and more kids truly have the tools for engagement and learning. But we also use these skills as a GPS for the environments you're working in. Imagine if every setting intentionally knew how to develop these skills in kids. What would that mean? To me, what it means is that we don't have to wait to fix poverty, to fix what poverty does to children's development. This would be the ultimate equity play. Thank you so much.
Right.
Thank you.
Let's head up, you guys. Come on up. Tia, come on up. Okay, while Tia and Arnold take the more pedestrian route back up to the panel, thank you, Dr. Cantor. Thank you, all three of you guys. And we're going to jump right into panel conversation real quick, some reactions to each other's presentations. That was a lot of information and really important. And then we'll open it up for questions shortly. A couple of things, we debated about some aspects of this because we're all in this room about the opportunity youth population. But we thought it was really critical to lay out the underpinnings of how we get to the nearly 6 million out of school, out of work youth and young adults, to understand the pipeline, to understand that somewhere between a third or more of those opportunity youth are actually parents themselves. And so how do we break that cycle of stress and support pathways that are actually thinking about the two-generation implications? And so that's part of the frame for why we want to look at this, womb to tomb, or however you want to describe I've got worse ones than that. I'm not going to go there, but just think about what rhymes with worms and at the end, and never mind. So I want to just start the panel with you, Dr. Cantor, and just ask you to think about, there's some exciting new research around teen brain development. You highlighted the elasticity piece, and can you just speak to the sort of older youth who are coming out of that kind of trauma question that a lot of people, I think, are asking in their heads right now?
Sure. One of the things that is really interesting and emerging research is the opportunity that happens in kids in their teenage years. Now, very often we look at it the opposite way. We think of teen years as just this rampant opportunity to know escalating levels of risk and take advantage of that. And a piece of what's going on in the teen brain is that. But very often what's going on is that when you have these periods of incredible plasticity and volatility, you have an equal opportunity for growth. So I'm very excited by the research I'm reading. One book in particular that I shared with another smaller group of you is a book called Brainstorm, which is the work of Dan Siegel. And Dan Siegel's work overall is a recapitulation of a lot of the things that I've talked about. But his newest work is specifically the neural sculpting opportunities of the teenage brain. So specifically your population. But the pathway that he'll talk about is the development of environments of trust and skills. Same.
Thank you. Take a step back, and any reactions that each of you might have to each other's work, and what did it trigger for you to see the different presentations? And anybody can jump in at any moment. But Arnold, we haven't heard from you in a while, so you should.
Sure. The message about plasticity being all the way up to mid to late 20s is an important and powerful point that stuck with me. I mean, I've known that we have, myelination still going on into the mid to late 20s, but it's just that fundamental idea, that notion that children aren't frozen after some early age period in some state that's unmalleable later on, even at the level of neurons. And so it's just that notion embodies, it's a critical message for this work. And it's not something that I would have internalized or held as top of mind as I now do. You've changed my thinking on that. I've always looked at this as, this early embedding that cascades into these social outcomes that produce pathways of disadvantage. But one idea that I've been noodling with, and maybe you'll help me develop this a little further, is this constant cycling back and forth between experience and health, or social realities and health. I've often, as I've encountered the health literature, look at or view or seen describe the notion that the social determinants of health stop at some point, and then health takes over, and then you have negative health outcomes that proceed from that. But I think the reality is that social determinants shape health outcomes, And then there are the health determinants of social outcomes that are just this constant cycling up through the early and late 20s, so that we separate the biological and health conversation from the social conversation in a way that I think is unproductive and not helpful to many of us who view ourselves as intervening at the social level, right? Intervening on social outcomes. And I think that has to change. And I think fundamentally, I was inspired, and it was just a beautiful presentation to watch. I was inspired to assert that more prominently in all the ways I talk about social outcomes.
How many of you can picture a child that you have worked with who has beaten the odds? Okay. So it's a lot of you. And if we had a whiteboard and we said, okay, what were the characteristics in that story, the beat the odds story? I mean, we know that one of them's got to be that there was an adult that saw the value, nurtured the value, picked the child up at a moment of failure, got them back in. I mean, these stories, we could each tell these stories today. Okay, but right now, these things are happening somewhat independently and accidentally. And if you were to take away anything from the three of us, it is we cannot let these things be accidental and individual, especially since the stories are largely going to be identical. Okay, they are going to have to do with trust. They are going to have to do with surmounting failure. They're going to have to do with skill building. I mean, we could write it on a whiteboard today, but this is what has to become part of the systematic ways in which all of our settings operate in order to change the direction of the train that you talked about. It can't be beat the odds for one child.
Right. Do you have any reactions to the reactions?
Well, a couple things. First, I realized I forgot the last bit of animation in my slides deck, which was that, ACEs, adverse childhood experience, among them are having a parent who's incarcerated, having a parent who is a substance user, or had mental health issues. And that folks with ACEs not only have all of those risks around morbidity and mortality, they're also much, much, much more likely to be perpetrator or victim of violence. And so seeing that big picture, being able to connect things like order maintenance, policing, mass incarceration, school pushout, when people say, well, yeah, what about brown on brown or black on black violence? Like, no, that system is producing it. That system is producing it. It doesn't strike me as an anomaly or in any way. But I think in around 2001, I went to the Hewlett Foundation and worked with Michael Walden, tried to start a program of giving around disconnected youth, right? And it didn't work. They cut it. It was a total failure. We wrote a paper in terms of what I wanted to get done. 9/11 happened and it was gone, right?
Yeah, and they ran out of money. I mean,
what would happen is, the stock market went down, and that was the first to go.
It was a great paper.
It's a really good paper, yeah. But it wasn't quite what I was shooting for. But at the time, when I think about why now this work is moving so much faster and more powerfully, it is about this research, and it is also about at the time we were doing that, people would say all this stuff, they'd say 0 to 5, right? The moving up, and we had just got this, oh wow, brains are still developing up to 25, as one of the reasons we chose 24 and 25 as the cutoff, was because, okay, maybe we can extend childhood and some of the goodies you get from childhood for the most disadvantaged, right? Yeah. But the emergence of research showing malleability and a number of proven programs that show this are incredible. But the final thing is like, I believe in beating the odds, and I completely, in a really powerful way, understand that relationship is at the core of this. So any of this stuff, the only thing the only thing that has been shown to decrease implicit bias is relationships.
Yeah.
Okay? Like everything you go back to, human connection is what matters. And it's not just one human being, it's being in that rich web around you, that social network. And that's what we're trying to create in our schools and for kids who are out of school and not in the labor force. And so that's why we called them disconnected and we wanted a reconnection, right? I also think, though, that as much as that'll help to beat the odds, we have to change the odds, too. Because that system up there that I tracked, that's not fair. That's not fair. That's a setup, okay? That's a straight-up setup, and expecting families or individuals to somehow power through it with grit is not right.
Well,
So we've been doing lots of work around, especially working with disconnected youth, working with these very young people to think about themselves as advocates for that change and for their peers, and how they can use actually that advocacy in combination with the kind of stuff that Pam is talking about to begin the process of healing and of rebuilding those connections and of rebuilding that rich blanket that should be around all of us.
Pam wants to jump in. Get ready with your questions. Mic runners, be ready to run, please. And Pam, you want to
Okay, last thing. Speaking of successes and failures, one of Turnaround's, in quotes, failures was to believe that a mental health intervention in a school could create sufficient neurobiological healing for enough kids. We had to face in our 10-year history that was in the necessary but not sufficient category. And that what actually had to happen is the school itself had to become the healing place. So kids would have multiple reinforcing experiences of trust. So this point about the rich web of relationships and trust and the reinforcing of that, I just can't emphasize Tia's point enough.
Yeah, so let's transition. What's I think really exciting about this conversation and the presentations is this is actually the scientific evidence we've been waiting for all the stuff that we know is effective when you think about back on track, reconnecting pathways. You know, we talk about the best pathways as being transformative, and we now know that they have to be transformative in a way. They can't blow off some of the pieces in the lower part of the building blocks to get to the grit and tenacity. Maybe we want to put the building block frame up if I don't know if our tech guys can do that. It's a tricky one, but Dr. Cantor's slide of the building blocks. But you know, we now have all this evidence that helps make the case. You know, when so many site visits to the best programs that reconnect opportunity youth. You know, they talk about how they ignore all the state regulations about how you can't hug children, or how they talk. You know, it turns out scientifically a hug is important, which just yeah, right. Which on a personal note, I still make my 17-year-old hug me every night to go to bed. Now I have the scientific argument for why. I can't wait to tell him that scientifically he needs that hug, and so do I. But you know, it's real that actually there's a whole bunch, and what we should do is unpack a lot of how the evidence and their piles of these guys they just walk around. I imagine like Arnold and Tia in an office together, and they just like sit around going, "Oh my God, there's a new piece of research out. Have you read it yet?" Like when the rest of us are talking about the Cubs. So, it's my point here is that I think we really have an opportunity to take this research and then really make the argument that we've always known about what works: a caring adult. Scientifically, we know this is what's important. So I'll stop there. Let's go to questions from the audience, and hands up, and we'll keep. I see a question in the back. Thank you.
Okay. Good morning. First of all, I'm Monica Navamsa from the Hopi Foundation, located on the Hopi Reservation in northeastern Arizona. I want to thank all of you for your perspectives. I think it was really educational, re-inspiring, also reaffirming for a lot of the things that we've been applying in terms of our cultural strategies and social strategies on Hopi. I feel like, though, that there is one another expert that's missing from the panel up there, and it's an expert that can speak to the economics, the impact of economics in this situation, because for a community as tight-knit as ours, we have very strong family and kinship relationships that have lasted hundreds and hundreds of years. Having that in place to some degree, to a large degree, comparably across other Native cultures across the United States, we still have a lot intact. Even with that in place, we still have the same problems. And I feel that what has displaced our community has been primarily due to the economics, what has happened to our community over the past 100 years, where we were entirely self-sufficient, and the movement to go into jobs to chase that dollar versus chase that corn that we're raised to believe and spend our time around, and that creates family units and interdependency, not codependency, as a community. So when I think about what you've shared in context of my community, I just want to put that out there because I know economics does play a role, not just in a rural setting like ours, but also in an urban setting. And if you have any comments to that.
Thank you, Monica. Anyone want to?
Well, I was going to say I agree, and then I'll
Yeah.
Well, economic instability is an ace. So
Economic instability, and I think there is the larger cultural question, and that we don't have time. We have 2 minutes left, but Monica, I think it's worth elevating that part of the dominant culture and the disease that sometimes comes with it in some of these contexts adds to the trauma and adds to the stress and is a multiplier, and I think that's complicated.
Yeah, and just on the point that just important a linchpin in that intergenerational cycle that Arnold draws, just as important as mass incarceration is changes in the economy, moving from GM to Walmart, okay? Like you can't, one of the things that makes me so incredibly proud of everything you guys are doing and happy to see how this has become opportunity youth, not just, is that you're talking about jobs. Okay? You cannot, one of the things is when we begin to talk about this, it begins to talk about, sounds like we're talking about disease, right? A medicalization of it. And when we medicalize things, because of how that is, we move away from things like the impact of jobs and poverty. But I don't think we can do any of this relationship building. We can't do any of this powerful reconnecting without the job piece. And you guys are taking that head on, and that's powerful.
Thank you, I'm sorry. Hands up if you have a question, because we're really kind of at time, so wowzer. So, so this is a request. There has to be a big, giant question mark in bold at the end of your question, and we're gonna do 3 right now, so we're gonna hold them, and then our panelists will answer the one that's easiest for each of them to answer, and then we'll move to a close, and we're gonna end 5 minutes late. Okay, Monique, thank you.
Hi, Nicole Yohalem from Seattle, South King County. And I wanted to ask, I think Tia probably maybe can speak to this best, but we are doing a lot of work through the Roadmap Project on changing school discipline, policy, and practice. It's one of our few advocacy priorities, and I wonder, and we've had some really great stuff happen. The Seattle Public Schools have just eliminated out-of-school suspensions and expulsions for elementary school. Highline schools is a goal to eliminate it altogether. So we're seeing some movement. I want to know what you think the most important levers for change are around that, like in districts that have really been making progress, because I think it's probably an inside-outside thing. I think data and advocacy are important, but what else is happening in the districts that are really changing those policies?
Okay, hold that question, next question, and also, Nicole, go to Tia's breakout, because that's going to be big.
Yeah.
Right there, thanks, and then over here.
there was somebody back there.
Okay, we'll do 4, and then that's it. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Chantal from United Way for Greater Austin. My question is thinking about the whole resiliency piece and overcoming the odds. It feels like to me that there's a missing variable there, because sometimes when you have children that overcome the odds, they're from a family where they grew up in a similar environment to other kids, and so there must be some piece there that makes them successful as opposed to their siblings growing up in very similar circumstances, and it feels like it would be really helpful to know what that variable is.
Question mark. That's good. You got a question mark in there at the end. That was perfect. Okay, so resiliency, what's the variable? Great. Andy, and then in the back, and then we are going to answer these comprehensively in 1.5 minutes.
Hi, Andrew Lewis, specifically to you, Dr. Cantor. Given the emphasis that both Tia and Arnold placed on the need to deal with the problem or address these challenges contextually and address the family units that are equally damaged or struggling, what are the outer age limits for neuroplasticity? And what's the latest research that's in the academy that isn't coming out? How plastic is the brain beyond 26, or does it stay that way?
Okay. Thank you, Andy. And Dana.
I'm Dana Bennett, Santa Clara County Opportunity Youth Partnership. Love your message. I hear the message of hope at the end, but yesterday my big gotcha was when Travian Shorters talked about how we look at deficit and how that's the first thing we look at. And I want to know how we can talk, there's a lot of deficit in this conversation, and I want to know how we can have this conversation and start with the hope or start with something and not be so focused on the deficit.
Okay, 2 minutes remaining. Dr. Cantor, we've got one specific to you from Andy, so do you want to start with that?
Is that the outer limits?
Yeah, the outer limits.
The latest research that I've seen poses actually no outer limits, but dosage around change as you get older is actually the determinant. So if you look analogously to an older person learning a new language, meaning a foreign language, and you look at that process and how much more difficult it becomes, so plasticity definitely goes down, but if the dose response to it goes up, then so context, will, skill come together, the brain is still plastic. So it's that factor that becomes the determinant, the dosage in.
Okay, assets, school, best practice in school policy change, and...
You should do the asset one.
You want to do the asset one?
I do.
Hope.
All right.
Okay.
I do. I don't want to look like I got a bone to pick, but I mean, I'm going to have to respectfully disagree with Travian, to be honest on this. And I'm more in agreement with Manuel, meaning the populations we're talking about are the populations of the future that will power our economy, and that's the asset side of this equation. But when we're talking about mass incarceration, when we're talking about these various social injuries to the body politic or to the individual body, those are markings of oppression. I don't call that a deficit. If I punch you in the face and you get a black eye, I can't say you have a deficit black eye. I did that to you. These things are being done. And so we're talking about the need to correct these. There's no pretty way to talk about mass incarceration. There's just no way to do that. And many of these things. And so, and I actually think the psychology of what we're talking about is not what might be taken by this notion of assets. I don't see a lot of folks reacting to what we're talking about and feeling demoralized. It's not encouraging, but there's some sense of purpose and clarity about the challenge before us that I think is galvanizing and mobilizing and provides some hope. The fact that these aren't laws of nature that have produced this reality, but a history of policy decisions in very real terms that we can identify and unravel is what we're really talking about, what we're really trying to challenge people to take on. And I don't want to, there's no way for me to talk about that in talking in an asset frame. I have to talk about the destructive reality of these deficits of society, not of the people that have been victimized by it.
And there's no medical innovation that ever happened without naming the problem, truthfully.
Yeah.
And we have to.
Tia, any final paragraph of advice or short bullet point?
Come to my breakout session. We'll talk more about it. Essentially, yeah, you need an inside-out strategy. You can bring down suspensions without changing a damn thing. Mm-hmm. The idea is we need to get more exact measures of a sense of belonging the young people are feeling, truly of school climate, of safety and community at the school level. In order to build that, that means real embedded coaching and PD for teachers and principals. It means really, really excellent execution of this. So it's not, Any number used to get people in trouble. If it's high, they'll figure a way for it to go low. And it could be a bunch of in-school detention, like happens in certain places in LA where the kids sit behind trifolds, right? So they can't see each other and they're doing nothing. So that harm reduction and that you're not on the street, and so you don't experience that 3 times the risk of contact with juvenile justice that's associated with being suspended, but nothing positive is going on there.
Well, lots of positive going on here. So, so we're going to take this to breakouts. I still need to understand what the plasticity of the brain means, but I can tell you mine hurts from all this incredible information. Thank our panelists. Please, let's all recognize them, and we'll conversation. Great job, you guys.
I do want to encourage you to attend their sessions for additional questions. We'll meet back here at 1 o'clock for lunch, and we're going to officially kick off the closing plenary right at 1:15. See you all back here.